Hi, my name is Christakis, and I'm a physician and a social scientist, and the discipline I'm going to be speaking to you about today is sociology. Sociology is the field in which you study human behavior and human experience, and how it relates to the fact that individuals are embedded within larger groups and collections of individuals. When you see an individual as a member of a group or of a collectivity, you get a completely different perspective on that person and on the groups of which they're a member. In sociology, we explore a fundamental tension. On the one hand, you yourself have your own identity and your own agency and your own ability to make choices that affect your life. But on the other hand, there is a collective responsibility for your life as well. Super-individual factors like where you live, or where you are located in these vast face-to-face networks that we human beings assemble, or what kinds of formal institutions are near you, like governments or hospitals, for example, can have as much to do with what happens to you in your life as your own decisions and your own actions. This is the difference between structure and agency, between collective constraints and opportunities that constrain and permit you to do certain kinds of things in your life, on the one hand, and your own individual choices and actions that permit you to do other sorts of things on the other hand. That's the first big idea that I'd like to communicate today. A second key idea in sociology is that collective phenomena are not mere aggregations of individual phenomena. There's something special, something weird almost, about groups of individuals, about collectivities, something weird that you cannot see if you just study individuals, but that you must study whole groups of people in order to really understand. So how did I become interested in these crazy ideas? Actually, I started my career as a physician, and I went to medical school, and at the time I wanted to be a reconstructive surgeon. And I wanted to operate on people who had craniofacial abnormalities, or people whose extremities had been cut off, and reattach these extremities. And I used to cut class my first year of medical school and go operate with some of the surgeons at the Children's Hospital in Boston. And I did this for quite a while. And eventually, as we would operate on these kids, they were primarily kids, one after another, day after day, I came to the realization that the kind of healthcare that I wanted to practice was not the kind that took care of people one at a time, but rather the kind that tried to take care of whole populations of people. I mean, I wanted to understand, why do groups of people become sick? Not just why do individuals become sick? And how can we make groups become well, not just individuals become well one at a time? And part of this was prompted by my realization that I was running around putting my fingers in the dike. One hole after another was springing water, and we were running around, all of us, trying to plug these holes. And I was interested in, how can we make a better dike? How can we make a situation in which fewer people become sick to begin with, in which we spring fewer holes to begin with in the dike, as it were? And in fact, I began to ask what I came eventually to see as sociological questions about the origins of illness and disease and suffering and death in our society. And I wanted to understand how we could have a sociological response, a collective response to these sorts of problems. And in fact, this dovetails to some extent with an interest in public health, which can be contrasted with a kind of interest in clinical medicine, which takes care of patients one at a time. So sociological ideas find widespread application in public policy and in public health. Anytime you design an intervention where you intend to affect large groups of people instead of individuals, you're conducting a sociological intervention. So for example, when we think about public policies that affect our public spaces, how we design our cities, for example, or we think about mass media campaigns to get people to change their sexual practices, for example, those are examples of sociological interventions, interventions which don't just seek to take into account individual desires, but they're interventions which seek to take into account the whole structure around the individual, the structure in which the individual is embedded. Because by changing the structure, you can also change the individual. So let's start by taking a look at a personal testament, a very seemingly individualistic statement that a human being is making about their own life, about what would seem to be a quintessentially private, individualistic decision, namely whether to take your own life and to commit suicide. This is Charlotte Perkin Gilman's suicide note. She was 75 years old when she took her life. The time is approaching when we shall consider it abhorrent to our civilization to allow a human being to die in prolonged agony, which we should mercifully end in any other creature. Believing this choice to be of social service in promoting wiser views on this question, I have preferred chloroform to cancer. Despite the fact that this woman is taking her life, and despite the fact that she's writing a suicide note, notice that the note contains or alludes to a kind of connections to others, even as she was ending her own life. She bemoans the fact that society is not sensitive to her pain, and even while dying, she's trying to make a contribution to society. She's trying to be connected to other individuals. Here's another note. Dear God, please have mercy on my soul. Please forgive me. I can't stand the pain anymore. And that note was written by a 76-year-old grandmother who, isolated by depression and disability, crawled into her basement freezer to kill herself by the cold. And you might ask, what kind of a social system permits this to happen, permits one of its members to be so alone, to feel so isolated that this is the choice that they would make? And in fact, you might ask, was this suicide truly an individual act? Was it really purely an individual choice? Another one, Ron Burst, jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, and in his will, he donated $10,000 to AIDS research. This is his note. To the San Francisco Police Department or equivalent jurisdiction, this is to state that I, Ron R. Burst, did take my own life due to the fact that I have the disease AIDS, and it has progressed both rapidly and to the point where, number one, I constantly feel ill and have almost no energy, and number two, I very soon expect to become a burden to my friends and family, and I do not want to put any of them through such an ordeal. I sincerely regret any inconvenience that this may have caused anyone involved. I honestly believe that a fast end such as this, while one is still able, yet ill enough to justify it, is easier on my close friends who have been so unbelievably supportive emotionally for me, and my family who have been no less so, than to drag this out. I did not give up. So again, in Mr. Burst's note, notice the social concern. His death is not an individual act at all. First of all, it was public. He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. People saw him. Second, it was guided by a concern for others. He's worried about his friends and family. And third, it's infused with the social ties that connect him to his family and his friends. Now, there's another way that suicide is social as well. It's not just the connection the individual has to others. It's the responsibility that others have to the individual. It's about how social and structural factors constrain or permit individual acts, even like suicide. For example, this is an image of the Golden Gate Bridge from which Ron Burst jumped. And this bridge is unusual in its design because the sidewalk, as you can see, is directly next to the edge. He walked along the sidewalk and then just jumped over that railing, stood there, and jumped right over. This is a picture of Kevin Hines, who almost met the same fate as Mr. Burst. In September of 2000, at the age of 19, suffering from depression, he went to the Golden Gate Bridge, and he stood there for 40 minutes, crying. No one approached him to ask what was wrong. And then eventually a tourist came up and asked him if he could take her photograph. Hines interpreted this as a clear sign that no one cared. He took the picture, and then when she walked away, he turned around and he jumped right over the railing. But instantly, he says, he realized that he had made a mistake. He changed his mind. Oh shit, he thought, I don't want to die. What am I going to do? He later recalled. In midair, he came up with a plan to save his life, as he described as follows. It was simply this: A, God save me; B, throw your head back; and C, hit feet first. It takes 4 seconds to drop the 220 feet from the height of the Golden Gate Bridge to the water, and you eventually reach a speed of 75 miles per hour. And among the over 1,200 people who have jumped off the bridge since 1937, only 26 are believed to have survived. And interestingly, a large percentage of those who attempt the jump, when they're interviewed afterwards, say that they regretted the decision as soon as they jumped. For example, another jumper, Ken Baldwin, was 28 and also severely depressed in August of 1985 when he jumped. And he later said the following thing: "I still see my hands coming off the railing. I instantly realized that everything in my life that I thought was unfixable was totally fixable, except for having just jumped." Even allowing for the fact that we cannot know what all the successful suicides would have said had we been able to interview them, these kinds of reports by people who jumped and survived beg the question of how to prevent these kinds of supposedly purely individual acts. What would happen to these people if somehow society could have prevented them from jumping, if there somehow had been a structure in place which had constrained the agency of these individuals? One landmark study conducted in 1978 of 515 people who were removed from the Golden Gate Bridge before they had jumped and followed them for an average of about 26 years afterwards, found that 94% were still alive or had died of natural causes many years later. So suicidal behavior is acute and crisis-driven. And if the individual is prevented from acting on their suicidal impulses by those around him, it might not be repeated. There are quite a number of remarkable things about such stories. No doubt these individuals and their illnesses are central actors in the experience of the individual. But I want to highlight two other observations. One is the role of the perceived indifference expressed by the person that Kevin encountered, because this highlights an important theme or an important idea in sociology, namely the idea that we are all connected to each other. The role of connection in our experience of the world and the role of our embeddedness in others is in fact a key consideration or a key point that sociologists are interested in. The other important thing to realize from these stories is the importance of extra individual factors that help determine individual outcomes. As I alluded to, the role of structure versus the role of agency. Now, the Golden Gate Bridge has a footpath adjacent to the railing, unlike most bridges, and people still regularly kill themselves from it. And if you look at the Golden Gate Bridge, you can see some ideas about how we might constrain individual agency, how we might as a society respond to prevent people from jumping. For example, suicide barriers such as this one at other sites have drastically reduced and often even eliminated suicides, such as at the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building, or the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But a barrier has not been put at the Golden Gate Bridge for reasons that many, myself included, find a bit silly, namely that it would somehow ruin the aesthetics of the bridge. But here's an artist's rendering of one possible solution, and it doesn't look so bad. This argument, it turns out, has been around for years, but finally in February of 2010, the Golden Gate Bridge Board, after many years of lobbying, agreed to put some suicide nets under the bridge to catch jumpers, but they did not agree to assign the use of any toll revenue for this purpose. So still there's nothing there to prevent suicide. So this is a particularly specific and dramatic illustration of the interplay between structure and agency, between policy decisions made at the collective level and the ability of an individual even to stay alive. Moreover, this is a particularly powerful illustration not only of the issue of structure versus agency, but also of more complicated ideas, namely the issue of group-level phenomena or of emergence, which is the second big idea I'd like to talk to you about today. Now, suicide has been used as an example to illustrate this idea ever since 1897 by a very famous sociologist by the name of Emile Durkheim, who wrote about this topic. He was looking at suicide rates in different religious groups in different periods in France. And he found that these rates are constant across time and vary across religious groups, even though the individuals, members of those groups in those particular times, change dramatically. So the Protestants in 1800 France are completely different than the human beings who are the Protestants in 1850 France. And yet the suicide rate, let's say, is the same. Hence, this constancy of rates and this variation across societies is indicative of something else going on beyond individual choice or individual biology. It's as if society determines this seemingly purely individual act, this seemingly purely individual choice. And Durkheim had a number of arguments, including the following. He wrote, "The individual is dominated by a moral reality greater than himself, namely collective reality. So you see, groups can have properties of their own, and the individuals within them are affected by those properties. One way to understand these ideas of structure and agency and of emergence and of the relevance of collections of individuals and how they can affect the individuals within those collections is to think about social networks. Sociologists have been studying social networks beginning with the pioneering work of Georg Simmel in the 1890s. And they've been doing this, studying networks, for well over 100 years. And social networks are one particular kind of supra-individual factor that can affect individual choices, that can shape your destiny and shape what happens to you in your life. Now, by social networks, I don't mean Facebook or MySpace or the kinds of recent networks that many of you might be thinking about. I actually mean the kind of face-to-face networks that human beings have been making for tens of thousands of years. In fact, ever since we lived on the African savanna. Now, each of us forms or inherits certain kinds of connections to friends, to coworkers, to our relatives, to our neighbors. And each of those individuals, in turn, also has friends and coworkers and relatives and neighbors. And as a result of this, we form this incredibly ornate, almost Baroque structure known as social networks. And we proceed to live out our lives embedded within these networks. Now, what's the difference between a group and a network? Here's a group. And a group, maybe of 100 people, but a network, in addition to the 100 people, also has ties, the ties that connect the people to each other. And it has specific ties at that. And there are two kinds of networks, artificial networks and natural networks. Here's an example of one of the simplest type of artificial networks you can imagine, a bucket brigade. A bucket brigade is an arrangement in which you line people up and you have a bucket that moves from one end to the other. People pass the bucket along. And this can be done either to transport water, for example, to put out a fire. This is an old-fashioned technology that people used. Or it can also be used to transport debris. If you want to transport debris a great distance, instead of having people running haphazardly, transporting buckets one at a time, you can have a series of buckets that are run to the front, and the full buckets are moved to the rear of the line. It's a simple linear network. It has 100 people, to which we've added 99 ties. Everyone is connected to the guy on the right and to the guy on the left. And assembling the people in this fashion gives this group of people properties it didn't have before, like the ability to efficiently transport debris or the ability to put out a fire. If these people weren't assembled in the network in this fashion, this linear network, they couldn't do it as well as they otherwise might. Or you could take the same 100 people and the same number of ties and organize them in the form of a telephone tree. This was an old-fashioned technology to efficiently transmit information before we had the internet. So the person in the middle, indicated by the arrow, he would have a list of 2 people that he was supposed to call, let's say to notify everyone about the closure of a school because of a snow day or something. He would call 2 people, each of those people would call 2 people, and the information about the school closure would rapidly and efficiently and accurately be transmitted throughout this group. Or we could take the same number of people, 100 people, but now a different number of ties, and assemble them into a completely different organization, for example, into military companies. Here we have 100 men and women composed into 10 squads of 10 people, and within each squad, everyone knows each other very well. There's a dense interconnection of ties. And this kind of organization, this kind of structural organization, is able to elicit from these individuals something that wasn't present there before, namely a willingness to die for each other. So this structural form of organizing people is able to call forth from the individual people or foster the emergence of new properties that weren't necessarily there before. But natural social networks look nothing like the artificial networks we just saw. They look more like this network. Here's a slide, in fact, of such a natural network illustrating one of our own studies. And this image was one that we made in order to help understand the role of social networks in the obesity epidemic. Beginning a few years ago, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, it had become fashionable to speak about the obesity epidemic. And it was clear that obesity was epidemic in one meaning of the word, meaning that there's more of it than there was before. For example, just in the last 10 years, the prevalence of obesity has gone from about 20% to about 30%, and fully 2/3 of Americans are now overweight or obese. So something is going on that has given rise to an increasing amount of obesity. And there are a number of structural factors that have been suggested as causing the obesity epidemic, because we don't really believe that there's something biological going on here. Even though the individual's biology can explain variation between people and how big they are, our biology hasn't changed that much over the last 30 years. So something social, something else must be going on to help explain why obesity has been rising so much. And people have offered a number of structural explanations. Maybe there's the declining real price of food. Food is cheaper than it used to be, so by basic economics, you're going to buy more of it. Maybe it's the marketing of food, the way food is marketed to us, or the fat composition of food. Or there have been other sorts of changes that affect how many calories we use up every day in the course of our lives. We have more sedentary lifestyles. There's been a change in occupations. We have a more service-oriented economy than a labor-oriented economy. There's a changing pace of life in our society. The design of our cities, urban design and suburban design. People don't move around as much anymore. And people had offered all of these kinds of explanations for the obesity epidemic. But we wondered whether we could add an explanation, whether we could understand obesity as being truly epidemic, as if something were spreading from person to person. It wasn't just a metaphoric epidemic, it was a literal epidemic. Could we find evidence for a kind of social contagion whereby weight gain in one person could affect weight gain in other people to whom they were connected? And in fact, we began to think about obesity in a sociological way. Could we think about obesity and the epidemic of obesity as being somehow related to the suicide example I was discussing earlier, where something collective seems to be determining individuals' likelihood of killing themselves? Could something collective be contributing to individuals changing their body size? So to the extent that obesity is a product of personal choices and voluntary behaviors, the fact that people are embedded in social networks and are influenced by the appearance and behaviors of those around them led us to suppose that it might be possible to find evidence of the spread of obesity within social networks. So we needed a special kind of data to do this. And this image shows 2,200 people drawn from the very famous Framingham Heart Study in the year 2000. Every dot is a person, and every line between them represents a relationship between the two people. Bigger dots are bigger people. And in addition, we color the dots yellow if people are properly obese. And if you look at this image, you can see clustering of obese and non-obese individuals within the image. It's still a very complicated image, but if you study it mathematically, you can find evidence of these clusters of yellow and red dots, so that people's body size seems to be related to the body size of other people to whom they are connected. And we were able to analyze these data and discern evidence for the clustering and interpersonal influence, such that if people around you gained or lost weight, it affected you as well. And it seemed to spread from person to person, and from person to person to person, and even from person to person to person to person, so that weight gain and weight loss seemed to spread within the network. And one uses various kinds of statistical methods to analyze such data, ranging from all kinds of statistical models to social network analysis to actual experiments that one can do. Now, in the process of studying the obesity epidemic, we did something else as well, because we also made movies about how social networks change across time. And our initial motivation was to see if we could literally visualize the spread of obesity from person to person to person to person within the network. Many of you may have done an experiment in high school in which you took a water table and you dropped a pebble on the water, and then you had these waves that emerged from where the pebble hit the water, and these waves would hit the perimeter of the table and bounce back. And if you did it just right, you would get a standing wave on the surface of the water. And if you didn't do that experiment, you probably had another experience as a kid, which was sloshing around in your bathtub. And you probably remember that if you slosh just right in your bathtub, you can get your body into sync with a wave and get a big wave that'll come out of the bathtub and splash onto the floor and make a big mess. And that's a kind of a standing wave as well. And what we thought we'd be able to do would be to see waves of obesity within the social network. Because you can imagine networks as a kind of sociotopological surface, a kind of hyperdimensional surface, and that it might be possible to see waves within this network, so that as I gain weight, it makes my friends gain weight, and as my friends gain weight, it makes their friends gain weight, and you literally could get a wave within the surface. So this little video animation I'm about to show you was both the most exciting and the most depressing moment of my scientific career. Okay, so again, every dot is a person, every line between them is a relationship. Again, we make the dot size proportional to people's body mass index. So bigger dots are bigger people. And we color the dots yellow if they're properly obese. And on this image, we only show two kinds of relationships. The gray lines indicate spousal connections, and the purple lines indicate friendship connections. So two people connected by a line, it's not because they share genes in common. These are purely volitional social relationships. And so in a minute, we're going to put this network into motion. We're going to take daily cuts through the network for 32 years, every single day evaluating the structure and status of the network. And what you're going to see across time is you're going to see people be born and die. Images, nodes are going to appear and disappear. You're going to see relationships form and break. You're going to see marriages and divorces, friendings and defriendings, the real old-fashioned kind of defriending, not the Facebook kind of defriending. And you're going to see dots get bigger and smaller as people gain and lose weight. Mostly you're going to see the dots getting bigger, and you're going to see a sea of yellow, because this period of time from 1971 to 2003 includes the period of the obesity epidemic. And when you look at this image, I want you to think about, as we were thinking about, could we see a wave, evidence of spread in the image? Okay, so now you're seeing the network evolve. People are marrying and divorcing each other, friending and defriending each other. You're going to see people gain weight and lose weight. Mostly they're going to gain weight. Now you're going to see the growth of the epidemic. You're going to see mostly a sea of yellow at this point in time as the epidemic is really kicking off. And we're approaching the end of the animation now in just a moment. And by the end, you can see that there are clusters of obese and non-obese, yellow and green sectors within the network. But when you look at this, the question is, did you see this wave or not? And we didn't see it. Like I said, this was both the most exciting and the most depressing moments of our scientific careers, because we were convinced that if we went through the trouble to collect these data and make this type of an image, after 5.5 years of effort, we'd be able to see this wave. But when we looked at this, we didn't see it. And it took us a whole day to figure out why. And the reason is that obesity is not a unicentric epidemic. It doesn't have a point source. It's a multicentric epidemic. It has many sources. And the proper analogy is not a single pebble being dropped on the surface of a pond, but a whole handful of rocks being thrown on the surface. Every rock falling, plunk, 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 makes these little concentric waves, but the waves interfere with each other, and you get this choppy surface, this chop on this sociotopological surface, this hyperdimensional object that is a social network. So other kinds of statistical and mathematical tools were required to discover or uncover the extent to which there is a wave. And using these tools, we were eventually able to show this type of influence from person to person within the network. But the interesting thing as we made this image was that it totally shifted my perspective on what was happening here. Because I came to see the world differently. This network, when you look at it, it moves. Things flow within it. It changes and evolves. It's resilient to injury. It has a memory. It has a kind of a coherence and an endurance across time. I came to see social networks as living things, as a kind of human superorganism. They have a life of their own, of which we are all a part. And you can think of human beings in this way as having these kinds of properties, these emergent properties, because we partake of this bigger whole. Because we're a part of this other living thing, you can think of us as being constituent parts of it. And our membership in this bigger thing affects us. Just like the point Durkheim was making earlier about the suicide rates in France in the 19th century. So now, what might be some possible mechanisms or explanations of the spread of obesity? So here we might think of the alter, that's the other person, and the ego, that's you. So one possibility is that the alter's appearance or behavior could change the ego's appearance or behavior. So for example, your friends say, let's go have muffins and beer. It's a terrible combination, but your friend suggested it, so you copy your friend's behavior, and you gain weight as a result of the muffin and beer diet that you've assumed. A second possibility is that the alter's appearance or behavior changes your expectations or perceptions of norms. Here, what spreads from person to person is not a behavior, but rather an idea. And when we analyzed our data, we found evidence for both sorts of phenomena. We found some suggestive evidence that as the people around you change their body size, it resets your expectations about what an acceptable body size is, and so you go on to gain weight or lose weight accordingly as well. Now, many social sciences take people's tastes and desires as a given, and they try to figure out why people do what they do, given that they have particular tastes or desires. How do they maximize their utility? But one of the distinctive ideas of sociology is that it seeks to understand where do these tastes and desires come from in the first place. Why do you want what you want? Why do you desire what you desire? And in part, it turns out that our desires and our wants are determined by the collective, are determined by the groups of which we are members. And longshoreman and social critic Eric Hoffer once opined, when people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other. Our choices and experiences depend on what others around us are doing and feeling, from obesity to smoking to voting or even to our emotions. And in a sense, this means that we have less free will than we think we might have. Now, one can also ask other deeper questions, like why do social networks look the way that they do? They always kind of look like the image I showed you earlier of the obesity network, but they never look like a regular lattice. Why don't we live our lives in this kind of a structure? Why don't we make networks that look like this? Well, the striking patterns of human social networks, their ubiquity and their apparent purpose, beg the question of whether we have evolved to have them and to have particular kinds of networks in the first place. And so now the questions become, why do we form social networks in the first place, and why do they have the structure that they do? And to understand this, we need to dissect network structure a little bit first. So first of all, notice that in this network, every position is the same as every other position. Everyone has 8 friends, every one of their friends in turn has 8 friends, and if you took this surface and you wrapped it around the surface of a donut, of a torus, there would be nobody that was any more towards the edge or towards the middle of the network. Everyone would be equidistant from the edge. Natural social networks are very different. So for example, if you look at this network, you can see that different individuals have different kinds of locations within the network. Consider, for example, individuals B and D. So B has 4 connections, and D has 6 connections. And if you talk to those individuals, they would know this about themselves. I've got 4 friends. I've got 6 friends. I've got no friends. I've got 10 friends. People know this about themselves. And that's obvious. But there are other aspects of our network that are less obvious. For example, contrast nodes A and B. They're different. They both have 4 friends, but A's friends are by and large friends with each other, and B's friends are not friends with each other. This is known as transitivity. The friend of A's is back again a friend of A's. But the friend of B's is not a friend of B's. It reaches further within the network. And if you look at C and D, you can see that they're different. They both have 6 friends, but there's something different about C compared to D. And I can cultivate this intuition in you by asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? You'd rather be D. You should have the intuition that it's better to be on the edge of the network because that person would be less likely to get what's spreading, and if they get it, are more likely to get it later in the course of the epidemic. Now, let me ask you, who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip were spreading through the network? Now you'd rather be C, be in the middle of the network and get it. This can be formalized mathematically, the difference between these individuals, and it's known, as I said, as their centrality. And this bird's eye view of the network makes these sorts of differences apparent. And it turns out that where you're located within the network, whether you are A, B, C, or D, or types of individuals like that, depends in part on your genes. Again, depending on the circumstances faced, different positions are different. So people often say, well, what's the best location in the network? The answer is it depends. If a germ is spreading through the network, it's better to be in one place. If information about where to find a job is spreading through the network, it's better to be in another place. So you can think of networks as a kind of vast fabric of humanity, and we all occupy particular spots within the network. There's another way that social networks affect us. It's not just what's happening to the people around us that might ripple through the network and affect us. It's the actual structure of the network itself. Now think about these 2 objects. They're both made of carbon. But if you look at the structure of the objects, the graphite on the left is made of carbon atoms assembled and connected one way, and the diamond on the right is made of carbon atoms assembled and connected another way. So you connect the carbon atoms one way and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. And you connect the carbon atoms another way, you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are 2 key intellectual ideas from this observation. First, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness do not inhere in the carbon atoms. They're not properties of the carbon atoms, they're properties of the collection of carbon atoms. Second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. And similarly, the pattern of our connections with each other affects the properties of groups. It's the ties between people that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. New properties emerge because of the connections between people, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. And in fact, our experience of the world depends in part on the actual structure of the social network ties around us. And this is like the artificial networks we saw at the beginning of the bucket brigade and the telephone tree. You take human beings and you assemble them one way, you get one set of properties. You assemble them another way, you get a different set of properties, just like the carbon example. So here's a more specific human example of how social network structure can affect the constituent individuals. This is some work done by Brian Uzzi, a sociologist at Northwestern University. He became very interested in Broadway musicals and why some Broadway musicals are a big success and other Broadway musicals are a total disaster. And what he did is he put together a sample of over 300 Broadway musical production companies, and he looked at the structure of the production company, the network structure, and assessed how it was associated with the financial success and critical acclaim of the Broadway shows that those companies put on. So here you see cartoon images of how the networks might be assembled. You see that there's a central individual connected to 5 other people. And amongst those people, there can be 5 times 4 divided by 2, 10 possible connections. And in the cartoon, you see there are none of those connections. 0 of 10 of the ties are present. And we would say that there's 0% density in this network. Or you might see that all 10 of the ties are present. So you have 10 out of 10, 100% density. And density is sort of like transitivity that we were talking about earlier. Or 4 of the 10 ties are present, so you have 40% density. And what Uzzi did was he plotted on the x-axis the density of the Broadway musical production company, and on the y-axis how successful the Broadway musical was. How much money did it make, and how many favorable reviews did it get? And as you see by the parabolic shape, on the left, if you have a network in which nobody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And at the other extreme, if you see that everybody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. But in the middle, if some of the people knew each other from before, and some of the people didn't know each other from before, the show was a big success. So what seems to matter here is it's not just the individuals putting on the show, it's the structure of the network that affects the likely success of the show. And Uzzi has gone on to show that there's similar work or similar findings with respect to scientific collaborations and other sorts of groups that people can assemble. Okay, now it turns out we're not the only species that assembles ourselves into networks and gives rise to other sorts of special properties. And so to push this point home, this point about emergence, this idea that collectivities can have properties that are not present in the individuals themselves, let's consider a further example. This is a slime mold. It's a primitive amoeboid fungus. And all this fungus does is digest wood. So this thing lives on the forest floor, and if you've ever lifted up like a pile of leaves in the fall, and they're wet and soggy, and you've seen those little white tubes under, that's what this thing is doing. The little fungus forms connections to other nearby funguses, they fuse, and they make these long tubes, and they digest wood, and they distribute the waste from their digestion through these tubes. But it turns out individuals of this species, in connecting to each other, form a kind of superorganism with unexpected properties. For example, they can solve mazes. So if you take a maze and you put it on a kind of agar plate and you put food at 2 different spots, the entrance and the exit to the maze, and by food here I mean like something like wood or like an oat flake. If you put oat flakes at the entrance or the exit of the maze, this simple organism will change its shape and connect the 2 sources of food by finding the minimum path length solution between the 2 points. If parts of the organism are spread out on the gel, they will reassemble to form a kind of single superorganism. And so they evince a kind of maze-solving property, a kind of primitive intelligence that's not present in the individual organisms themselves. And this work was done by a Japanese mycologist by the name of Toshi Nakagaki. It's the fungi working collectively that give rise to this property, this maze-solving ability that emerges from their interactions. In fact, you can use this kind of maze-solving ability, or this ability to find the optimal paths, to do other sorts of things. Like here, we show an image. On the left is the rail network designed by human beings in England. And on the right is some work done by my colleague Mark Fricker at Oxford University. He took the map of England and he put little oat flakes at every city, and he plated the amoeboid fungus. And the amoeboid fungus gave rise to a path connecting, or a set of paths connecting the oat flakes that actually imitated and in many ways was better than the rail network that human beings had designed over 200 years. So if you look at these two things side by side, you see that the fungus is able to design a railway system for England, in fact, a better system than the one that they have. Still, what's the point of a connected life? How does it help us as an individual or as a species? It turns out that social networks are a resource that we can all use. They're a kind of social capital. Now, most people, when they think about capital, think about money. But really, capital is any stock of resources that can be put to productive use. Two further key ideas about capital are that in order to create capital, you have to invest skill and effort, you have to know something and do something in order to acquire capital. And second, and more subtle, you have to work upon the world and transmute it. You have to change the world. You have to introduce changes in a substance that makes it more productive than it was before, that makes it capable of yielding a higher rate of return than it was able to do before. So, for example, think about this. You can have a forest, you can invest skill and effort, you can clear the forest, and you can make a farm. And this farm is a stock of capital. It's more productive, at least in terms of fruits and vegetables and grains, than the forest was. And by investing skill and effort and working upon the land and changing the land, you have created a reservoir of wealth, something that's capable of being used in a fashion that wasn't possible before. So land, and especially improved land, is a form of capital. Or think about this idea. You can take this tree, you can invest skill and effort, and you can transmute the substance of the tree and mill it into lumber. And the lumber is more valuable than the tree. You can invest still more skill and effort and convert the lumber into a violin, which is more valuable than the tree because it reflects this additional investment of skill and effort, and because in having changed the wood even more, you're now capable of doing things with a violin you couldn't do with a lumber, like make music. So capital is a change that allows a substance to act in new ways. And this is part of what makes it a store of wealth and a source of productive power. Now, a key innovation in thinking among social scientists took place in the 1960s, spearheaded primarily by economist Gary Becker, to begin to think about human beings as a form of human capital. And the chief example of this is education. If we endow someone with skills and knowledge, we have changed them and they have become more productive. So if you look at this sort of dissolute graduate student of mine, you can invest skill and effort, you can clean him up so that he's no longer a drunkard, and now he's capable of doing things he wasn't capable of doing before. Or you can invest still more skill and effort and give him an education, and now he's even more able to do things he wasn't able to do before. So you have changed the substance of his mind. You have reworked the real world. You have taught him things, you have changed his brain and made him more productive and more capable of doing things that he wasn't previously able to do. Now, just like physical capital is created by a change in the material world, and human capital is created by a change in persons, social capital is a change in the relations among persons. A change that renders the group more productive and capable of doing things it wasn't previously able to do. So social capital can arise in at least two senses when we think about social organization. First, we can think in terms of what's flowing through the group and across these connections. Is information flowing? Are germs flowing? Are emotions flowing? Is altruism flowing? Is this the kind of network in which desirable things are flowing through the system? Is this the kind of group in which positive things are primarily moving? First. Second, social capital can arise in a second sense, which is how the groups of individuals are organized or connected in the first place. The idea is that social capital is a property of collections of individuals, a property that did not exist before the people were assembled into this network, and moreover a property that does not inhere within the individuals themselves. It's a property of the collection of individuals, again illustrating the idea of emergence that we've been discussing. Now, one of the important aspects of social capital is that it is a public good. Now, a public good is one in which there's no exclusivity in consumption. So everyone can benefit from it. Think about the difference between this cake and this lighthouse. If you have a cake, there are two things you can do with it that are relevant to what we're discussing right now. First of all, you can prevent anyone else from eating the cake. It's your cake, no one else can touch it. And second, if you eat the cake, there's none of it left for either you or anyone else to use. But think instead about the good that is the light that comes from the lighthouse. Your using that light to avoid crashing on the shore doesn't prevent anyone else from using the light. Not only that, but there's no way to consume the light. There's no way to use it all up. So a public good is one in which there's no exclusivity in consumption and everyone can benefit from it. And public goods typically arise by accident. Maybe one group of people puts up the lighthouse because they're really concerned about it, maybe a port authority or a private entity that is concerned about their ships not crashing. But now that they've put it up, everyone can benefit, and their benefits do not reduce the ability of the intended individuals to benefit. Social capital is sort of like that. It's a public good. It arises by accident from people's interactions with each other. It's not a deliberate thing that we do. We don't set out to make it. And once we create it, though, everyone can benefit from it. Social scientists have developed a number of overarching approaches to understanding human behaviors and human society. One classic way of understanding collective behaviors is to look at individuals themselves. For example, we can see markets or elections or riots as the mere byproduct of individuals' decisions to buy and sell goods, to vote, or to express anger. And the classic example of this approach, which is known as methodological individualism, is provided by Adam Smith's conceptions of markets, where each individual transacting their business as if guided by an indivisible hand gives rise to a kind of an efficient market. Now, another classic way of understanding collective human behavior dispenses with individuals and focuses on groups with collective identities that cause people within the groups to act in concert. Some scholars in this tradition, like Karl Marx, even believe that groups can have their own consciousness, imbuing them with a kind of indivisible personality that cannot be deduced or understood from the actions of its members. Others have also focused on the primacy of group culture. For example, as we saw, sociologist Emile Durkheim argued that the relatively constant rate of suicide within particular religious groups and in particular places at particular times could not be explained by the actions of individuals and must be properly understood as a property of the collective, as a property of the groups. How was it, he wondered, that people came and went, but the suicide rate in French Protestants stayed the same? This is known as methodological holism. And this approach sees collections, sees groups, sees society as being distinct from the constituent individuals, and sees the society and groups as having properties that cannot be deduced merely from studying the constituent individuals. Now, in the 20th century, many social scientists focused on how membership of individuals within groups denoted by particular attributes or characteristics, for instance, race or class, affected or helped determine the behavior of those individuals and maybe gave rise to collective phenomena. But the social network approaches, some of which we've been discussing today, offer a further way of understanding human society, and in fact, a way perhaps best suited for the 21st century. Social networks are about both individuals and groups. And in fact, they're about how individuals become groups by connecting to each other. Interconnections between people can give rise to phenomena that are not present with individuals themselves and that are not reducible to the solitary desires and actions of the individuals. The issues of social capital and emergence and the phenomenon of social networks that we've been discussing illustrate the issue of how we can come to explain social phenomena using alternative approaches. On the one hand, we have methodologic individualism. Here, in this perspective, explanations for social phenomena, such as social class, markets, power, institutions, and so forth, must be formulated as, or reducible to, the characteristics or actions of individuals. On the other hand, we could have methodological holism. Here, this perspective sees each social entity, group, institution, or network as having a totality that is distinct from and that cannot be understood by merely studying its individual component elements. So, for example, we may be able to understand markets by using an approach of methodological individualism, but if we want to understand market panics or bubbles, we probably need an approach that uses methodological holism. And holism, in fact, as you probably have gathered, is related to emergence. Various social phenomena, for example, culture, can have an enduring reality that transcends individuals. And Durkheim, for example, argued that social facts can and must be studied by looking at groups of individuals, not individuals themselves. Social capital is complicated because certain aspects of it arise as byproducts of individual actions. So it's true that individuals choose their friends. But in choosing their friends, they give rise to a collection, a network that has its own properties. So while the individuals contribute in some sense to the emergence of this phenomena, they are not a part of the phenomena. The phenomenon is distinct from the individuals. And in fact, the study of social networks illustrates something else. It's part of what I call a much broader assembly project of modern science. For the last 400 years, swept by a reductionistic fervor and by considerable success, scientists have progressively dissected matter into ever smaller bits. So we've disassembled life into organs, and then cells, and then molecules, and then genes. And we've disassembled matter into atoms, then nuclei, then subatomic particles. And we've invented everything from microscopes to supercolliders to study ever smaller bits of matter. But across many disciplines right now, scientists are trying to put the bits back together again, whether it's macromolecules into cells, neurons into brains, species into ecosystems, nutrients into foods, or people into networks. Scientists are turning their attention into how and why the parts fit together to make the whole, and how interconnection can give rise to properties that aren't present within the component parts. Understanding the structure and function of social networks and the phenomenon of emergence within social networks is thus part of this larger scientific movement. But sociology has always been doing this. It's always sought to put the parts back together and to make a bigger whole. It's always realized that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Moreover, sociology has always emphasized the extent to which we are not, in fact, masters of our own destiny. And in this regard, sociology has concerned itself with another ancient philosophical concern, namely the issue of free will. Because sociology is interested in the ways in which what happens to you aren't just a product of your own agency, don't just depend on your own choices and actions, but depend on broader structural factors outside of your control, like the race of your parents, or your birth order, or your birth weight, or the talents you happen to be born with, or superstructural factors, such as the networks you belong to, or which country you were born in, or the relative wealth of these countries, or the culture of these countries, or the other attributes that surround you that you as a part of now come to partake of, and as a result determine your destiny just as much as your own individual choices and actions. It's the tension between structure and agency that we opened with. To what extent do our destinies depend on our own behavior, and to what extent do they depend on these larger factors that we've been discussing today? If you had asked social scientists even 20 years ago what was their fantasy of the ideal kind of data that they could have, they would say, oh my goodness, we would love it if we could have these little tiny helicopters that were microscopic and invisible, and they flew on top of every person, and they monitored this person 24 hours a day, looking at what this person was buying, who this person was interacting with, where this person was, what this person was thinking. And if they could do this for millions of people in real time, that would be amazing. We would have a kind of data that would allow us to understand society and individual behavior in a way we never could before. But of course, that's what we have now. In our everyday use of cell phones and credit cards and online networks and blogs and all these administrative records, we leave these little digital breadcrumbs as we move about our lives that can be pulled together and studied using new analytical and computational tools that give us whole new insights into how and why society operates. And the availability of all these new kinds of data heralds the onset of a new kind of computational social science. The availability of data of this kind is only increasing and will continue to increase. And these data, properly analyzed and subject to ethical rules, can allow us to understand and address all kinds of important social problems, from violence to poverty to epidemics to political extremism. Many people think that the internet is changing something fundamental about human interaction. It is changing a few things, but the way I would describe it is that it's the same but different. If you could ask your great-grandmother how many friends she had when she was a 10-year-old girl, she would probably say to you, I had 1 or 2 best friends, and there were 4 or 5 of us girls that were very close. And if you ask my daughter, Lena, the same question, she would give you the same answer. Now, how can this be? How can Lena have the same number of friends as my great-grandmother? In the interval of time, we've had the invention of the telephone, we've had the invention of walkie-talkies and the radio, we've had invention of the internet, we have all these technologies. Yet the fundamental reality of our social interactions hasn't changed. And the reason for this is that what determines our social interactions is our minds. And our minds have not changed in the last 100 years. The capacity of human beings to desire interactions with others and the capacity of human beings to influence and want to be influenced by others hasn't changed. If you're interested in understanding why people do what they do, why they have the tastes and desires that they have, or if you're interested in understanding and sometimes why people behave irrationally, and why so many problems seem to arise in our society, like violence and political extremism and poor health, for example, that seem to be so against an individual's own desires or even an individual's own interests, you need to understand the extent to which larger collectivities, larger structures, give rise to these processes that transcend individual desire, that transcend individual benefit. If you want to understand all of this, then you need to understand sociology. Thank you.